Hey guys, so this video is going to be about an issue that I've been having with my 2002 Ford Focus ZTS manual transmission. For a while now, when I would be driving, about once every 3 to 4 months, the vehicle would shut off on me and then randomly start back up. Since it's a stick shift, it would just bump start itself. I couldn't figure out what was happening until I was at a buddy's house this weekend when I physically watched it actually get worse. What I found out after jumping one of my buddies and putting my battery box back on was that the heat from the EGR tube had actually melted off some of the plastic around the positive battery cable. And every time I would make a turn, it would make contact with the engine and short out the engine, it would stop. Now, when I was at my buddy's house, I physically watched it spark and actually break a part of the EGR tube, which was creating gases to come out. So I'm going to show you how to replace the battery cables and EGR tube. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do in order to work on this project is remove the battery. We need to make sure that there is no power going to any parts of the cables or any part of the engine or vehicle. So in typical fashion, when I noticed that the positive wire was messed up, the terminal broke off at the exact same time. So when I went to Advanced Auto Parts to get a new terminal, I realized that the Ford openings on their terminals are not the same size that a positive connector is. So I had to use the negative just to get me home. I haven't driven it since. Removing the battery, you're going to want to remove the positive end first. And for me it's a 12, but your vehicle should be a 14 millimeter. Now that that is off, I'm just going to switch it out and take off the negative cable. Once again with a 10 millimeter, and then just pull it up. Once that's up, we just have to take care of the battery hold down over here. Once you remove the battery hold down, it's time to pull out the battery. So once you have the battery out, the next thing you need to do is remove the 3 13 millimeter bolts holding in the battery tray. That way you can gain access to a lower section for the power cable and the EGR tube. Alright, now that those 3 bolts are out, just got to wiggle out the battery tray. After you remove the battery tray, the next thing we need to do is remove the air intake and air filter box assembly. Once we have the air filter box assembly out, we will have more access to the ground wires that we need to get to. Now before you move the airbox intake, you want to make sure you remove any wires that are connecting to electrical parts. To save you a little bit of time, just disconnect it from your throttle body and remove it as one solid piece. Now's a good time to replace your air filter if you need to. Now that you have the intake hose off and the top part of the air filter, the only thing that's left to do is to pull the lower part off. Now this is just stuck in with some grommets, so just a little bit of force and it'll pull on up. You just want to make sure that you remove this hose off the side of the valve cover. Now that we have it removed, we can see one of the bolts here for the negative cable, and then we can follow it down to where there's more wires for the terminals. Now that everything is removed from the vehicle, I wanted to give you a good look at what the EGR tube actually looks like. This runs all the way back from the EGR valve on the back right side of the engine all the way down to the exhaust manifold just before the catalytic converter. In the back you will have two hoses that run off the back with the large tube that actually bolts into the EGR valve itself. This shows you a little bit more of the front angle of it and how it actually twists around a little bit. The first thing you're going to want to do is remove the bolts holding the EGR tube in. After that, you want to remove the hoses at the back gently with a screwdriver if they're stuck on. I was able to pry them off very easily. With the hoses removed, you're going to have access to the bottom of the EGR valve to loosen the nut. This is going to be a 1 1/16 of an inch nut. After that is removed, you will go to the last bolt on the top next to the coils, which is going to be a 10mm bolt. Once that bolt is removed, you now need to go under the vehicle for the final nut. This nut is going to be on the exhaust manifold just above the catalytic converter. I found it best to cut the EGR tube off using a cutoff wheel in order to actually get an 1 1/16 socket on there. I was not able to get enough leverage to actually loosen that nut up and had to use an impact wrench to break it free. Alright, so now that you have the tube out, what you need to do is after you match up your EGR tube to make sure it's the same one, you need to reassemble it. Now you're going to have to stick the part that goes to the catalytic converter in first, but you're going to hook that one up last because there's more to deal with up here. Makes it a little bit easier to work with when you can move it around a little bit. Now it's a tight fit, but it will go in. Now I made a very simple mistake right here. I put the tube over top of this line, but that's an easy fix. Since there's no pressure on the engine, I can easily just remove this tube, which just goes to the overflow. It'll lose just a little bit of coolant. Nothing really important. And then you put it back on. It's not a pressurized line by any means, so you're fine. No need to re-bleed your system out. So now that that's there, you just go back through and start reconnecting all your pipes, ensuring that everything is lining up correctly. We're going to start with the bolt right here. That'll help stabilize the front end. I'm just putting these on very loose, that way I still have some play. Since there's still play, you have room to stick the tube up inside the EGR valve. Now run the nut back up. Now since this bolt is going vertically, make sure you're putting it the correct direction. Righty is actually going to be counterclockwise. Alright, so now that I have the EGR tube connected to the EGR valve, one little trick that I noticed is you need to angle it slightly backwards. Push it more towards the engine because the EGR tube on mine is not 100% perfectly straight. So where I was trying to put it in normal, it wouldn't go in. So next thing you need to do is reconnect your hoses. Now an easy tip is, if you look right here, the hose on the right goes on the right. The hose on the left will actually go on the left, which is going to be the lower hose. So it keeps it nice and simple, easy for you to remember. Just rerun this all the way back down. Once again, this is a 1 1/16". The only thing I have left to do is tighten up the bolt on the bottom. Alright, so now that everything is tightened up, the bottom was actually a whole lot easier than I thought it was going to be. What I ended up doing as I was tightening up the nut, I was shaking this tube, and that was moving it around just enough that I could free up the nut to get it as tight as possible before I cranked down on it and made it to its final tightness. But now that it's set, what you gotta do is come back here and reattach these bolts nice and tight. Since everything is all lined up, you know it's tight. Another thing I noticed was that this thing was loose. I'm just going to retighten this thing back up. That way I don't have any issues. Hose out of the way, nice and solid, no problems. That is how you finish replacing the EGR tube on a 2002 Ford Focus ZTS. Thanks for watching part 1 of this 2-part series where we replaced the EGR tube on a 2002 Ford Focus. To continue watching this project, click on video 2 to watch the install of the positive and negative battery cables, as well as addressing some common issues with Ford electrical parts. Thanks for watching, and subscribe below.